it's my pleasure to bring up Claire Berry.
Thank you, Anne. And I want to thank all the members of my intrepid audience for coming to all of my lectures. I know there are docents, collectors, and very committed museum goers in the audience, professionals, and I really appreciate your interest in the subject. So in this final lecture, I will be talking about finding the final surface, compensation of losses, and varnishing. You might have noticed last week that when we were looking at paintings before and after cleaning, you never saw them in the clean state. I was waiting till today to talk about how we handle losses. So let's begin. A lot of people are curious, like, do you use really small brushes? And yes, we usually do. So I just thought I'd show you some photographs of different conservators in painting. I use brushes anywhere from a 000 to a 1, which is to say, really pretty small. Again, we're in painting losses. We're not feathering over losses. We're not extending beyond the borders of the losses. And if a painting is varnished, it would receive its first brush coat of varnish as an isolating layer to saturate the paint layer, and the in-painting would be carried out on top of that barrier. But we'll see more about that later. So here are the guidelines for the compensation of losses. The in-painting that we do must be stable and reversible. It's restricted to the areas of loss. We almost always choose an in-painting medium that's different from the original. I think sometimes that rule is broken, but that's the rule that should be followed. And different approaches to in-painting are used, and I'm going to be walking you through some of those approaches. Ideally, the in-painting process results from a dialogue, ideally an interdisciplinary dialogue that considers all aspects of the work of art, the artist, the period, the scale of the painting, where it will be hung, etc. Some of the different approaches to in-painting. First approach is do nothing. Second approach would be to tone losses with a neutral color that harmonizes with the painting but is visible to the naked eye. A third approach would be the trateggio technique. This was a technique developed in Italy just after the war. And with this technique, vertical lines of color are employed to kind of create a general tone to infill the lost area. When viewed from a distance and when trateggio is well done, the losses really disappear. But at closer viewing, the viewer can see, oh, this is an area of loss. I can distinguish that from the intact areas of the original. This was very popular in Italy and then gained popularity in France as well. Then there's an approach that would involve partial in-painting to regain the balance of the original paint image without falsifying the overall compromised condition of the painting. I'll be showing you an example of that. And finally, probably the most widely used approach in this country is a complete in-painting of losses to imitate the artist's original handling, making the losses visually disappear. First, I'll show you an example of the do-nothing approach. I've shown you this painting before, the beautiful Bellini Christ Blessing, and I've explained that the torso of Christ now has a kind of farmer's tan because a previous restorer had raised the level, of the loincloth to cover the navel. And over time, the different parts of the torso, the protected versus the unprotected part, they age differently. So in all the years that I've been at the Kimbell, I've been very aware of this, and it's a painting I've considered cleaning many times. And in the end, I just never really felt the pressing need. And I think to just tone back this area, I don't really see the point. Why tone over intact original Bellini paint, even if there's a slight tonal difference? So this was an example of a do-nothing approach. Many of you will remember the devastating flood in Florence in 1966. And one of the most highly damaged pieces was this Cimabue Crucifixion, 1280 from Santa Croce Basilica, where some 60% of the paint surface was lost because of mud and water. And I'm showing you images of the crucifixion before and after the damage incurred by the flood. In this case, the Italian restorers opted to simply tone back the losses with a neutral color in order not to falsify the image and to make it the losses readily detectable to the viewer. It is disconcerting to see this piece and to think about how recently it suffered this loss, but I don't disagree with the approach. Is it when 60% of the surface is lost, it would be a challenge to deal with. We've looked at the Duccio Maestà, and I'm showing you the overall views of the altarpiece, front and reverse. A few of the panels have been separated from the altarpiece. One of them resides at the Kimbell. And, you know, with Italian paintings of this period, you also see when there are areas of loss, you often see conservators adopt an approach, just generally tone an area or perhaps do trateggio. And I'm showing you, comparing the Transfiguration on the left with the Kimbell painting on the right. And I want to focus on two details. You can see the kneeling figure on the left. The whole upper part of the figure is lost. And here the conservator adopted not to do trateggio, but like the Cimabue approach, to simply do a flat neutral toning of the loss. And I want to point out in the on the right, St. Lazarus, you see a kind of horizontal band going through across the sarcophagus through the face of Lazarus. That band is a discolored band of old retouching. And again, over the years, I've thought, you know, should I just go back and tone that? And I don't know why I was just, and I know I've discussed it with many people at the Kimbell, but again, it just never seemed to be such a priority. And I think partly it's in response to the period of the piece, knowing that if it was restored somewhere else, it might have had this general toning or trateggio technique. You can clearly see that there is a damage there, but it is toned back. It doesn't distract that much. And it helps you to distinguish between the intact areas that are by Duccio and this one area of damage. It's also in an area where we have pentimenti showing through, and you can see where the tomb was once horizontal and now vertical. So you know, I'm not saying that mine was the right answer, but I simply was in the end not motivated strongly enough to change it. Now I'm going to run through a few examples of the trateggio technique. And of course, there are varying degrees in carrying out this technique. In some cases, the loss becomes virtually invisible, even though the artist, conservator, is consciously making, you know, using these hatched brush strokes and, you know, just toning it back, not trying to match exactly the original. But in the forehead of the Christ child, and there in the center, and on the left, you can see where I've circled it with the red line. I hope that you can see a very skillful use of the trateggio technique to set back this area of loss. And again, considering the scale of this painting, I doubt any viewer visiting the Maestà would even know that there was a loss to this area, but we, looking more closely, we can see the difference between the intact original and the restoration. Here's a more obvious example and maybe a more typical example of the way trateggio is technique. This is a detail of a crucifixion scene from the museum in Barcelona, where again, you see a general toning, but you can certainly distinguish quite readily between the intact original and the kind of striped handling of the loss, the inpainting of the loss. And as I've said earlier, this technique, which was developed in Italy, in Rome, right after the war, gained a real popularity in France, especially in the 1950s. And so this painting by Vivarini of St. Peter from the museum in Avignon had suffered, you know, significant losses in the background, and these were toned back using this trateggio technique. So it's a technique that's particularly popular with paintings from the 15th century and earlier. The Mantegna we've already looked at. And again, I just want to repeat that this is a painting that has suffered a lot of abrasion from past cleaning and even structural damage. It has several old tears. And John Brealey, who the late John Brealey, who was really an expert on Mantegna, he restored the entire Mantegna cycle at Hampton Court. He restored this painting, and his approach was to not disguise the fact that this painting had suffered damage, but simply to carry the painting to a point where the composition regained a sense of balance and harmony. And so in the details, for example, on the right and the next few that I'll show you, you can still see that there's areas of abrasion. And yet the painting reads in a very balanced, harmonious way. I was pleased when I saw the painting in the Mantegna retrospective at the Louvre that it hung very happily next to paintings in a better state of conservation. So I thought John's approach was very, very appropriate in this case. Here is a very large painting by Giraudet, and in the background, it suffered wide areas of what we call drying cracks that you can see on the right. These are cracks that form when an artist is using a paint that's too medium rich over an underlayer that might not be completely dry yet. And so this is an example of what we would call inherent vice, but very distracting in this case. And here the conservator opted just to use a lighter shade of blue as a flat color and tone all the cracks that color. And I think, again, given the size of the painting, when you stand back, I don't think they're very distracting. And imagine trying to in-paint every single one of those cracks to make them visually disappear. You could spend a long time doing that. This is the Vermeer girl with a pearl earring. On the left, almost in a clean state with just a few patches of yellowed varnish left. But this is really fairly typical. This degree of loss would not be unexpected in a painting of this period. And as a conservator, I look at this photograph with a sense of relief. Oh, those losses aren't that bad. I mean, yes, there's one more significant loss in her cheek, but the face is intact and most of the costume, most of the losses are concentrated in the background and are what I would consider minor. And so these were in-painted to visually disappear completely. And I also want to make the point, while we have this comparison, that you can see the effect of applying a varnish on a painting of this period. Look at how light and chalky the background looks in the clean state photograph on the left, and how much more saturated all the glazes in the face are, the blue part of her headdress, and how her costume has so much more volume and depth. That's what the aesthetic impact of varnishing this painting. And it's something that Vermeer aimed for. This was what he had in mind. He knew that he wanted his paintings varnished, and this was the effect that he wanted. I'm bringing back John Brealey and Mario Modestini. We've talked about them before. I was trained by John Brealey at the Met. I knew Mario Modestini when I lived in New York and after, and they were both worked at the top of their profession in New York, and John before that in London. And they were friendly. Maybe sometimes they didn't see eye to eye on everything. And I think one area was how far to go with in-painting. Mario was known as being master in-painter. And sometimes I think John thought he might have gone too far. So I'm going to show you some of Mario's restorations. The first one, I think this was one where John, when he realized the true state of the painting, might have taken a different approach. But I want to say Mario's restorations were impeccable, and he did always respect, the outlines, the boundaries of the losses. But this is a little predella panel by Giovanni Di Paolo, now in the Cleveland Museum of Art, St. Catherine of Siena, invested with the Dominican habit. I think you already are thinking maybe if this painting had been restored in Italy, it would have been done differently, with strategio or more of a flat toning. But Mario did more of the, he in-painted the losses in a very masterful way, so that I don't think the viewer would be aware of the condition of the painting, seeing it in the gallery. I do think that where a painting lives, whether it's living in a museum collection, whether it's on the market, whether it's in a private collection, the context also influences the approach that's taken. As I said, what we hope for is that there's a dialogue between the owners of the painting, the conservator, the art historians. This is another example of a Mario Modestini restoration, very well done, of the El Greco Vision of St. John, with these minor scattered losses. Again, it's a little bit shocking to see the amount of loss, but as a conservator, I think, but at least they're small and they're scattered. And I think in this case, I would have opted for the same approach that Mario followed, because I don't see a lot of invention here. It's more like filling in of little losses. And I think the finished state looks beautiful. Then you all know the story, I think, about the Leonardo Salvator Mundi, which recently, I guess in 2017, sold at auction at Christie's for $450 million, the highest amount of money ever paid for a painting. And the owner would, or the current owner would have had access to the clean state photograph that I'm showing you on the left. This was widely known. Diane Modestini, Mario's widow and a close colleague of mine from the Met, did the cleaning, or the painting had been restored in the past, of course, several times. So she removed the old layers of restoration and redid the in-painting in a very, very precise, meticulous manner. And she did a masterful job. But again, I think, let's say if the Metropolitan Museum had bought this painting, who knows, they might have followed a different approach. But here we see it before and after. And again, there was everything was documented. The condition was widely known. Some of you may remember that this painting was considered for acquisition at the Dallas Museum before it eventually was sold many years later at auction, and the Dallas Museum would have been fully aware of the condition. So, but I just think for the purposes of our discussion today, it's an interesting example to think about. And I just couldn't resist showing you the Bartolome Gonzalez y Serrano, the most recent acquisition by the Meadows, with the stripped clean state on the left and the final state on the right. The black dress had suffered the most, and I've come to expect that in paintings like this, because blacks, especially a black dress, it often contains a lot of resin, which is more susceptible to overcleaning in the past. There had been some areas of damage, but and even some slight abrasion, which I'll show you in the face. And so, again, I was trying to help the painting regain its balance, so that the viewer could just appreciate all the beautifully painted passages without being distracted by the losses. But I didn't feel the need to in-paint every little dot of abrasion in the face. You can see there was a small loss by her eye on the left, and some slight abrasion across the face, which I did tone back with tiny dots, some of those losses, to regain the glaze and so on. But everything's documented, written report, photographs, and this also resulted from a conversation with the curators here, which is what that's the way I like to work and prefer to work. We're jumping wildly into the 20th century, but what do you do when you're confronted with a painting like this Frank Stella that has not suffered any paint loss, but through a freak accident at the museum, and this was at the Museum of Modern Art in Fort Worth, a patching compound that was being used in the construction of the new building, a floor above, somehow leaked down, dripped down along a pipe and deposited itself across the surface of the painting, even though the painting was wrapped in Dartek, overlapping, sheet of Dartek, and hanging on a rack in the vault. It was exactly where it needed to be and was protected, but somehow that patching compound got underneath the overlap in the Dartek and deposited about 5 big splotches across the bottom of the painting. I was able to carefully chip those away. It was like chipping away plaster, but that left a ghost of 5 like halos across. And with a color field painting like this, an abstract painting, it was extremely distracting. So I really didn't want to go further without discussing this with Frank Stella. And fortunately, through some intermediaries, I was able to call him, and I was very reassured by what he said, which was, do whatever shows less. If it shows less to do the in painting, do that. If it shows less to leave it alone, do that. And after a period of some months and a lot of very careful in painting, I do think that that was the right approach. And I was really grateful to be able to have that conversation. With these older paintings, we don't have that option to discuss a treatment with an artist. Now I want to shift to varnishing. In my experience, varnishing is one of those critical moments, and I've seen this with myself and so many other conservators. It's like everything depends on this moment. You don't want to make a mistake. You've done your careful cleaning, you've done all of your in painting, but varnishing can make or break a restoration. You can apply a varnish that's too glossy, too thick, etc. Or you might apply a varnish that's too thin and it might sink in some areas, which means you have to go back again. Typically, as I said, when a painting is in its clean state, we would apply the first brush coat and then do any in painting on top of that. It saturates the paint layer, so it helps the conservator match the colors. And then to get the final surface, you would apply a spray, maybe several very light sprays, maybe one spray. This would be typical. To be honest, in the field of conservation today, there are many different kinds of varnishes we use. Anything from natural resin varnishes, which we are now better able to control the degree of discoloration with additives, to a range of synthetics varnishes, some of which are very good at imitating the optical effects of a natural resin varnish. So that there's not one varnish that every conservator uses. We have a lot of options. I'm also showing you just an array of brushes because after varnishing, it's not at all unusual for a restorer to go in with maybe a badger hair brush or some other type of dry brush to further help blend the varnish, or maybe pick up some excess varnish to achieve the perfect surface. I want to emphasize that varnish is really more of an aesthetic tool than a protective coating. This is a question that came up during one of my talks. The artist applies a varnish as a final surface to saturate the paint layers and impart an even level of gloss. But whether or not a varnish is used and how it is applied is solely the choice of the artist. Impressionist and Cubist artists, for example, and many 20th and 21st century painters never intended their paintings to be varnished. And this is something that over the years, conservators and curators have gotten wrong. For example, many Impressionist paintings were just routinely varnished. But around the late 1970s, when this painting from the Musée, now the Musée d'Orsay, the Camille Pissarro Paysage à Chapon Aval, was being cleaned, the conservators found a note written in the artist's hand on the back of the stretcher: please do not varnish this painting. And that really opened the door to this new awareness. Oh, Impressionists, and a lot more research into this question. And over the years, I've removed many a varnish from Impressionist paintings. we'll return to that a little bit later. John Richardson, after seeing, he's well known as Picasso's biographer, very influential critical thinker from New York. After the 1980 Picasso retrospective at MoMA, he was horrified at the condition of so many of the Cubist paintings that he saw, because many of them had been varnished and or wax resin lined, mostly by American conservators. And this was really worked against what Picasso was trying to achieve in his Cubist surfaces. So in their Cubist paintings, both Picasso and Braque experimented with juxtapositions of matte and gloss areas, smooth and rough surfaces. They used porous, absorbent paint materials, and even sometimes collaged newsprint directly on their paint surfaces. They played with faux bois, stenciling, and pointillist techniques. So many different techniques. It's really fascinating to take Cubist painting by, say, Picasso or Braque, and try to identify all of these different techniques. There's many more than I think most people assume, but these delicate, nuanced contrasts can be ruined by varnishing, which again, these Cubist artists never intended. So this next image, I want to show you, the Houston Museum shared these images with us. This is a Cubist painting by Picasso, female nude, from the spring of 1910, midway through the process of removing a varnish. So if you look on the left, I think you can see the very reflective area on the left there is where the varnish still remains, and you can see how matte the paint surface looks to the right of that. In the image on the right, we can see that the varnish is also very discolored, and you can see where it hasn't been removed yet, how much it's saturating the image, and on top of that, discoloring the image as compared to the much chalkier, dry surface to the right of that. Showing you two Cubist paintings from the Kimbell, the Picasso Man with the Pipe on the left. He originally painted on an oval stretcher in the kind of more traditional format for a portrait. Over the years, it had been lined onto a rectangular stretcher. And in the course of that, it had also been varnished. So we did remove the varnish from that surface. The Braque on the right, on the other hand, is in untouched original condition, still unlined and never varnished. So if you want to know what original Braque Cubist surface looks like, this is a good painting to study. You know, I've talked before about how varnishing can really saturate the darks and the blacks. And the Cubists did use a lot of stenciled letters, but when they wanted gloss, they would just add medium to their paint. And sometimes they intentionally added different amounts of medium or painted those letters in a different technique to make certain letters seem to recede or advance, as in the detail on the left. A varnish would have evened all this out and would have ruined the intention. So they created their kind of illusion in the painting stage, and they wanted the surfaces left alone. Just an example of faux bois, and on the left, in the upper right, a small detail from the Man with the Pipe, showing some of the Picasso's use of impasto, these impastoed bricks that appear all over the surface. And in the lower right, it's a detail from the Braque painting, Girl with a Cross, showing his handling of wet and wet gradated tones. Like I said, they're full of different techniques. They're fascinating to study. I had the great pleasure of removing a varnish coating from this wonderful painting from the Meadows, the Picasso Still Life in a Landscape, 1915. And you can see the black, this is an after cleaning image. You can see that the blacks still have a lot of that saturation, but in this case, it's coming solely from the artist medium. And I think you can see all the different techniques here, the pointillist technique and some of the rectangle in the background, the way the foliage is painted, etc. It's really a beautiful painting, and the lovely impasto in the whites. Two beautiful paintings by Miro from this collection. The Queen of Prussia, a painting 1929 on the left, was never meant to be varnished, but over the years it had been. So I did remove a layer of synthetic varnish from that painting. And that's how you see it now. The painting on the right, the Circus, 1937, painted directly on Celotex with areas of the support left revealed. And this is in beautiful, untouched condition. So again, it really, it serves as a touchstone for how, Miro intended this painting to appear. One of the most pristine unvarnished surfaces in this collection is the Dejores portrait of the Mestre family, 1927. When I was shown this painting, when it was being considered as an acquisition, I was so excited because it was almost as if it had just left the artist's easel. I later learned that it had been in the same family collection for many years before it was shown to Marc Roglan and then entered this collection. So it is just in beautiful, untouched condition and in its original frame. And as I understand, the painting was finished in its frame, which came out of the Gaudi workshop. So it's just a beautiful, wonderful example. I'm just going to play a little game here because this is something that I obsess over, and I'd love for you to, the next time you visit a gallery, maybe play this game yourself. Intentionally look at varnished surfaces and compare them to unvarnished surfaces. So again, the Leger on the left and the Kimbell is unvarnished. Look how matte and chalky the surface looks. The Mondrian, which again is in untouched condition on the right, selectively varnished by the artist, just the black lines. And when you're in front of the painting, notice how that plays against his handling of all the color blocks, which have wonderful texture of brushwork throughout. It's almost like a sculpture in low relief. That would all be obliterated to a certain extent, evened out with a varnish layer. A lot would be lost. The Boilly is of a period, it requires a varnish. As we discussed before, the Gauguin on the right had been varnished, but we knew, and that old discolored varnish was removed, but we knew that Gauguin sometimes waxed his paintings. He didn't want to varnish them, but sometimes he would apply a thin coating of wax as a final surface. And we discovered wax underneath the varnish and so left it. So this has a kind of a satiny sheen. Again, the Courbet on the left, he's really almost emulating Rembrandt in this picture. He had a panel that was prepared with a very smooth surface and a gesso layer, but he flipped it to the reverse and he used the rougher chiseled side of the panel for his painting. I'm wondering if that was also emulating the more kind of cupped or cracked surfaces of an old master. But this painting with its blacks and brown background, its glazing, absolutely depends on a varnish to come to life, whereas the Cézanne man with the blue smock on the right is unvarnished. And two landscapes, the beautiful little Caspar David Friedrich on the left, the mountain peak with drifting clouds, all the glazing in the foreground, the timber and the grass, the foliage. This painting needs a varnish to read accurately, whereas fortunately the Pizarro on the right is unvarnished. And we did find an inscription on the back of this painting. In this case, it was inscribed "A ma femme," but interestingly, it was painted when they lived in London, when they were not yet, they did marry in London when I think they already had 4 children. So it's been speculated that this was a wedding gift to his wife. According to Joaquim Pizarro, he never referred to her as ma femme until they were actually married. And finally, 2 paintings I love, I think finally, no, one more. The Vigée Lebrun self-portrait and the Matisse on the right. The Matisse is in, again, unvarnished, unlined condition. There is there's charcoal drawing, crayon drawing on the red paint surface. There's graphite drawing in her flesh tones. In her skirt and in her beads, there are areas of the priming left exposed. He scratched, he wiped his paint, a lot of different techniques, and this absolutely would be altered with varnishing. And again, a very nice example of another Fauvis painting that's in unvarnished, unlined condition is the Bonnard landscape at Le Canet at the Kimbell. So pay special attention to some of these surfaces the next time you happen to be there. So now I'd like to wrap up some final thoughts about what the last 40 years as a conservator have meant to me or taught me. As you may recall, what made me intrigued by the field and made me really want to learn more about it, become a conservator, was my exposure to the conservation department at the Louvre in the early 1970s, and realizing that there was this whole kind of laboratory behind the scenes that could take a masterpiece like the Mona Lisa and unlock a lot of the secrets by X-raying, preparing infrared images, taking paint samples, etc., learning more about the panel construction. And I've just became fascinated by what we could learn through science. Now, this is a painting that has not been cleaned in my lifetime. I don't know if it will be. You can imagine the controversy that would erupt. Also, the painting is considered unfinished, so that's another complication. But this is where my fascination with the field started. And recently, you know, this was a painting that I've experienced, was able to examine to a certain extent at the Dallas Museum, and have certainly kept up with the story in the press and through conversations with Diane and in a film. But I think whereas the Mona Lisa focused my attention on what science could contribute to the field of conservation, science doesn't really tell you how to deal with a painting that may be by Leonardo, but that's been damaged. That's where judgment comes in, dialogue comes in, and different conservators and different owners are going to come up with different solutions. Just to remind you, as I was training in my graduate program at Cooperstown, there was a big cleaning controversy playing out about the cleaning of these two paintings by Rubens and Rembrandt. And this was one of the, and that kind of divided the field into two camps. One camp with a more scientific approach that would include my graduate school teachers, and another camp that was arguing for a more humanistic approach, and that would include John Brealey at the Met. And I did study with both. And that really broadened my view of the field. And I'm so grateful that I had the experience of working with both of these conservators. Since then, I've had many, many other teachers, and I've also become a teacher myself and a mentor myself. And I thought, well, if I had to try to sum up for you today, with hearing all of these different viewpoints and these different experiences, what do I think constitutes the best practice for art conservation? So it relies on both science and humanities, in my opinion. Scientific examination, art history, archival work, and this is really important, a lifelong commitment to focused looking and experiencing paintings as physical objects. All of those things are essential. A collaborative and humanistic approach helps the conservator better understand and deal with changes in paintings that have occurred due to time, the artist's materials and techniques, and or past interventions, and to rediscover the artist's original intent, which is always our guiding principle. I've also reflected on the fact that a conservator's work really must be guided by a deep love and respect for works of art, which are the visual expression of the human spirit. And finally, I've learned how much I've loved so many people who have brought art into our lives to help preserve this experience for future generations. And we're remembering Mark Roglan. And I'd like to thank you all for your attention. We'll take some questions. And before I close, I do want to thank Luis Martin, the late Luis Martin, for funding this series, lecture series in the humanities. I want to thank Ann Kinseth and Russell Niedermeyer for helping with the setup of these lectures every week, for technical aid, for Amanda Dotseth, Bridget Marks. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Peter Van de Mortel, Chief Conservator at the Kimbell, and Ethan Kramer, his administrative assistant, for help with images. And finally, I'd like to thank Linda Custard and the Meadows family and SMU. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we're going to take some questions, and I'd love to start with one that came through on Zoom. So could you please talk about relining? So what is it? What's its purpose? And why is it needed?
Right. That could be the subject of another lecture, which we won't do this time. So in relining, you take a secondary, fresh piece of canvas and you adhere it to the back of the original canvas. And that could be adhered using a variety of different adhesives, ranging from glue or paste, which was traditionally done in the past, especially in Europe. Or it could be wax resin, which became popular after the war in the United States and sort of faded out of use by the mid to late 1980s. Or it could be using Viva, a more modern synthetic adhesive. But unfortunately, lining usually involves the use of heat and pressure. And so that can cause some flattening of the original brush strokes. Why would lining be done? For different reasons. Sometimes in the past, it was done as a preventative measure, thinking, let's line it now so we know it's going to be safe for all times. Maybe not taking into consideration fully that there was an aesthetic impact to that lining. And now we value so much the many unlined paintings. It could be done because a painting is actively flaking or really cupping, and there's the desire to bring the paint layer back into plane and make it more secure. So these are some of the reasons that it's done. All linings need to be reversible, but if, for example, as was the case with some wax resin linings, the paint layer is impregnated completely by the wax resin. So you can't always get all of that out, number one. And number two, if too much heat or pressure was used, say on a lining table, there might have been some slight flattening that occurred that's not completely reversible. So yes, you can always take a wax resin lining off, but some changes to the original may have occurred. Any other questions? Yes.
That the Varnish was purple and the restored.
That is solely the fault of pulling an image off the internet. So you were looking at two paintings coming from different sources, but no, the blue is the same color in the clean state and in the after cleaning. I was trying, because the painting had been photographed when it was first acquired by the dealer, Robert Simon, it was restored. And then that old restoration was redone by Diane Modestini. So I was trying to find a record of the painting after her restoration. And so, yes, the colors, but in reality, the color is the same. Any other questions? Yes. So are you talking about paintings in these areas? Or are you talking about sculpture and architecture? Paintings. It's not a different school, but within our field, there are many areas of specialization. And so someone who was interested in working on that period, that would become their specialty. And they would, they would seek out those projects and work with other conservators who had experience in those areas. Well, exactly, just like there was Well, that's exactly right. It's a little bit like the cleaning of the Sistine ceiling. That was done by a team of people directed by Gianluigi Colalucci, the head restorer at the Vatican. So I assume that the approach in these churches is the same. There would be a team directed by a specialist, and you're not necessarily going to learn in any great depth how to clean those surfaces in graduate school. That training comes later. That's where internships, fellowships are very important. Just as in the medical profession, most conservators after graduate school have several years of postgraduate training before they do their first job. Yes. How does it depend? How does it influence the value of an artwork at auction? Well, I think certainly there's a much greater awareness of the need to understand the condition of a painting that a museum or a private collector might be interested in bidding on. And so typically I think, especially for quote important or really valuable paintings, I think the major auction houses will ask a very reputable conservator to come and generate a condition report for that painting that any prospective buyer could look at. Also, if a museum is particularly interested in a painting that's coming up for auction, they will likely try to send their own conservator to see it directly. And you may remember that with the Goya portrait that the Meadows bought, that a team of us went up to examine it, Mark Roglan and Linda Custard and Jonathan Brown and I, and we all examined it together. So there's much more transparency with all of that now than there probably was in the past. And as I said, the Leonardo, you've now seen it in its clean state. It is the most expensive, it received the highest price ever paid for any painting at auction. And that condition was fully understood by the buyer. So it's hard to say sometimes how it affects it, but like if we were thinking of buying a Cubist painting or an Impressionist painting or a Fauvist painting, I'm always going to be much happier and prefer to buy a painting that's never been touched. But that doesn't mean we wouldn't buy one. So it's just something to consider. Anything else?
Yes, we have a question from Zoom.
Okay.
So this is about the Frank Stella. This person is interested in the fact that you spoke to Frank Stella, but he did not choose to get involved in the conservation process. Is that typical with a living artist? Or do living artists ever actually come in?
I don't think I can speak broadly for all living artists, such a diverse group. But I will say that with the Stella, he was by far not the only person I consulted. I also spoke to many of my colleagues who have much more experience working on color field paintings than I do. And so, as always with these challenging problems, you try to have a dialogue with informed people to be able to do your best restoration. I can't think off the top of my head of a contemporary artist who's gotten involved in a conservation treatment. I'm sure there are examples, but I just can't think of one right now. But, you know, again, I think I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, the importance of, while these artists are still living, speaking with them and recording their thoughts about their materials, their techniques, and how they want their works of art to look. And there's a group of conservators who are compiling these archives. And I know the late Inga-Lisa Ekman was one of the leaders in getting this project started. So that's very important work for our community to continue to support. Yes. You know, people ask me that all the time. And it's really, you know, I'm a little bit like a split personality because I have very, I feel like specific ideas about what I think would be right for a museum and different museums. And at home, there are no rules. I have all kinds of things hanging on my walls because I'm not even going to try to do that. So I'm not a collector in that I don't have a specific path that I'm following. I'm very kind of Catholic that way. And so more than what do I want to own, I guess the really honest answer is I want the museums that I'm close to buy at the very, very highest level and just keep improving their collections, because then I can go and see those paintings whenever I want. That's really what I want. I don't need to have it hanging in my house. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your attention and for coming to the series. Oh, yeah.
Mark was always particularly excited considering an acquisition if it were not mine. He felt that was very, very important, and I was with him as the evidence. And several other members of our Meadows Advisory Council. When we met the woman whose grandfather is in the Dejores.
Oh.
So we saw it in her lovely apartment in Madrid. And Mark was so excited about it. And after just, oh, we just had this.
I'm so glad you did. And I was saying this to Amanda yesterday. I said, and that's not a painting you would necessarily expect to see at any other museum in this area, but it seems to fit so beautifully with this collection. And I'm very happy it's here. So thank you all so much.